from the police stations, and we had witnessed some defections from the armies, and armed factions were formulated. And since the first week, the authorities disappeared from the main cities. This had led to the influx of the Libyan opposition, and as well as the Arabs and non-Arabs, and some of those who entered Libya at the time were leaders from Qaeda and ISIS. So Darna has become an emirate, an Islamic emirate, and Gaddafi has used this as a bogeyman in order to say that the Qaeda is controlling everything. Despite the fact that the Libyan army declared a war on these people, however, some pockets are still there. Al Qaeda is still there, and this war had continued for 3 years. Some of the terrorist elements from Egypt, Iraq, Syria, and other countries came along, and the militias were equipped with weapons without a centralized uh, leadership. They would uh, create a name for a certain battalion, and then they would fight amongst each other. Since the start, it was clear that some of the factions were successful, especially the Al Qaeda affiliated. However, the revolution in Libya had no head, had no leadership. The leadership later on was disintegrated. The transitional leadership council came along, but it was futile. The militias fought against Gaddafi, and most of them uh, dispensed with the ideological differences. They had one objective: they wanted to topple al Gaddafi, but they had no insight. They didn't know that these ideologies or the differences in the ideologies will be ominous. Abdel Fattah Yunus was abducted later, and two of his guards, and they were killed brutally. And as a matter of fact, that was the hallmark of the extremist factions. But when the Gaddafi was killed, infighting erupted, and it is still up to this moment. The militias ought to have handed over their weapons in the first place, but this did not take place, and new formations surfaced, especially from those who had committed crimes in the past and those who were released from prison. Indeed, rewards were given to robbers, looters, and those who embezzled money and abducted people for ransom and tortured victims before killing them. And within such a atmosphere, human trafficking were rife, and indeed, these formations played a major role in human trafficking to Europe. Before I tell you about the time, I want to know how many papers do you need to read. No, you are the chairman. You can stop me at any time. You've got 2 minutes left. Okay, and as a matter of fact, the armed groups, the ideological ones, most importantly, the those who are ISIS affiliated in the east and in the west as well, and Al Qaeda played a major role in this chaos. However, I would like to say that the Libyan south is different because people uh, do belong to Berber tribes, Arab tribes, and African tribes, and the southern borders are long. We have borders with Sudan, Chad, and Algeria. And the previous Libyan governments did not claim that they have capabilities to control these borders, and thus people used to move through the southern borders freely, and this had facilitated the influx of immigrants as well as uh, human trafficking. As a matter of fact, some of those who live in the south, especially the Tabu and the Tuareg, did not agree to have borders with other countries because of the affiliations with other tribes on the other side of the border. It is a commonplace to say that Libya is the source of terrorism in the Maghreb region, and as well as the source of immigrants who go to Europe. Those armed forces that run loose, it seems to me, as a matter of fact, I am not pessimistic, but I hope that we'll see an end of chaos in Libya, or albeit it is far fetched. Indeed, terrorism has been exported to the neighboring countries. Some of these, or most of them, or many of them, uh, are not Libyan. Tunis, Tunisia provided us with some of them, but Algeria was affected, Tunisia was affected by terrorism, and as a matter of fact, a lot of terrorist acts emanate from Libya. So Libya, it seems to me, will still be a source of nuisance. I will stop here. Thank you. Thank you. We'll move to Mona Bentidei. She's a journalist and a researcher from Mauritania. In the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful, all blessings are due to our Prophet, peace be upon him. As a journalist, I wanted to look at the matter from a different angle, from the angle of the yawning gap between the media openness and the explosion of information and data and the practices of the rulers and the shape of the regimes in the Maghreb countries. Albeit there are differences, however, this yawning gap and this economic and developmental failure, as well as the political fiasco, uh, had led to disgruntlement amongst the youth. As you know, the youth in Tunisia and Mauritania, in accordance with some statistics, are to the tune of 70%, and in Morocco it is to the tune of 54%. So the lack of the horizon and the lack of the economic participation and the autocratic regime, the totalitarian regimes, and the crackdown that took place, and the dismissal of human rights had led to the first wave of the Arab Spring, starting from Tunisia and moved through uh, other countries. Morocco has withered the Arab Spring in a smart way. As a matter of fact, in Mauritania in 2019, wanted to have a different transition of power, and because of the external and internal factors, the nowadays president would step down and it won't be a candidate any more counter revolutions surfaced. Tunisia is facing economic problem. Libya is facing uh, internal infighting, and some countries are living by certain army related controls and mechanisms like Mauritania and Algeria, and are their stability is fragile. I mean Mauritania and Algeria, and some countries that are hesitant in their political reforms that are slow, like Morocco. So the youth of these countries are dreaming of leaving the countries. Indeed, the death boats are emblematic of such crises, as well as the brain drainage. Some statistics say that 7 million Magharibi are immigrants in Europe and in the USA, Canada, and Australia, and to a lesser extent in the Gulf states. And this is a brain drainage. This would lead to great losses to such countries, and because of the lack of education. The IOM in its report said that one of the French think tanks received 1,600 Magharibi thinkers. When it comes to the secret immigration, in 2018 we had witnessed a huge influx of immigrants to the tune of 25,101 that reached Europe, let alone the youth who drowned in the sea. These features of failure made our Maghreb countries some safe corridor to drug dealing. In May 2018 in Algeria, a huge number of cocaine were confiscated, 750 kilogram, and this had made an uproar in Morocco. In accordance with the police, in Morocco, 1 ton of cocaine was confiscated in El Jadida from a truck, and it transpired that it came from Latin America heading towards Europe. And 8 days after this operation, the 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 Moroccan FBI's, in a certain town, 100 kilometers from Al Ayoun, there was a farm that resembled a launching pad for certain uh, airplanes, and indeed some people were arrested. 717 were arrested, two from uh, the gendarme, and three from the police, and two from the Royal Air Force. In Mauritania, the scandal of the drug airplane in Wadibu, it had 650 kilograms of cocaine, led to a series of scandals, especially one of the ships that unloaded 1.5 tons of cocaine as well to a boat in August 2017. In Algeria as well, the in May 2017 in Wahran, one of the most important hideouts of uh, uh, drug repositories were found 701 kilogram of cocaine. In Tunis, 104 drug smuggling operations were foiled in 2016. Drug dealing indeed runs loose in Libya because of the lack of, uh, uh, as a matter of fact, cannabis to the tune of 400,636 Uh, as a matter of fact, this is not an indication to say that the militias are stopping such drug dealing because they live on such trade. Terrorism in the Maghreb is another challenge because of marginalizing the youth as well as certain other elements that led to the lack of peace. Mali, for example, has a border with Mauritania that stretches over 2,000 miles and 100 or 300,000 of kilometers with the Algeria. And Libya is divided over itself. There is plenty of chaos, and there is no central government, and it is a source of nuisance and armed conflict and arms smuggling. Libya, despite the infighting, was also subject to terrorist acts, like the killing of the ambassador Christopher, the American ambassador. As a matter of fact, these are some statistics that you might consult in accordance with such with some reports. There is 56,000 Malian refugees in Algeria, and some reports say that there are 7,000 refugees and 90,000 in Hinduf camp. So the statistics are scary, immigration-wise, drug-wise, and refugee-wise, terrorism-wise, and I just give you a hint of the terrorist acts that took place in Morocco, and no country was saved from such terrorist acts. This these problems, as a matter of fact, relate to the yawning gap between the aspirations of the people and the dire circumstances, economically, socially, and otherwise. Despotism is the mother of all evil. Thank you. Thank you very much. We'll yes, the lady took some more time. Yes, yes. We'll open the floor for questions. But before that, I would like to comment on three issues. The uh, regional security supersedes the countries of the region, and uh, this is normal. But sometimes we forget that our security uh, uh, is transnational. The second issue is that the regional security needs coordination amongst ourselves, and this coordination is difficult sometimes because coordination is not that smooth. It doesn't provide us with the minimum level of collective security because there are certain contradictions of certain interests, and sometimes certain countries obscure certain information, uh, and this obfuscation might lead to uh, big problems. The third issue, perhaps it has nothing to do with this region, but it is there. There are two dilemmas. The dilemma of the security forces in our countries. The security forces resemble a state within a state, and it is difficult uh, i- to implement the security uh, without taking into consideration this, especially when there is despotism. Tyranny depends on these security forces, and even if there is a semi-democracy, as the case in Tunisia, the security forces don't like the democratization, so it resists change. There's also another dilemma which relates to the corruption within the security forces that ought to protect the population. So, when it comes to terrorism, the security forces might use terrorism as a bogeyman in order to dig its heel. When it comes to human trafficking as well, they can do so. So, its corruption might lead to this uh, issue. Then Jamil Mansour. Thank you. I'll come to the economic element here. What I've noticed that yes, some issues. I do think that in Tunisia we have made progress on the political front, the constitutional front, the institutional front, in order to restore some uh, trust or confidence in our institutions.
But what remains missing without waiting for the people, which threatens, in my opinion, the political democratic transition, is the economy, the aspirations of our youth, those who have contributed to the revolution, those who have called for the revolution, has found reactions in terms of liberties and media. All these things have been achieved, if not completely, relatively, and in a very notable way in Tunisia. But what threatens this democratic transition and which can lead to a setback is, in actual fact, a lack of a similar pathway, economically speaking, which has made our youth resort to migration. So, because of the lack of any hope and the gap that Mr. Ahmed Dries talked about, particularly between the people and the political elite, is the outcome of such a matter. We have a brain drain that is taking place very notably in the Arab Maghreb, not due to the fact that we lack liberty or democracy, but because of the economic factor that would enable them to live well in their countries. So this is one of the responses that are given by governments. These are constitutional, legal, responsible, institutional responses, but they turn a blind eye to one of the most important demands, which is economic and social uh, situation. So the solution does not lie in a democratic state, although this is very important, and I'm amongst the ones who contributed to the writing of the Tunisian constitution. But on parallel, or in parallel, sorry, we have to try to find solutions to poverty, because poverty has led our youth to join some of these terrorist groups due to the salaries that are paid by those organizations, because they would guarantee a better future. So this is similar to drugs and so on and so forth. And this should be given a great deal of importance as we give to institutions and the transition. So Iqbal was part of the Constituent Assembly. Thank you, Si Ahmed. I would like to talk about a matter that was mentioned by Dr. Hawass, which is very important indeed, which is linked to terrorism when it comes to the balance of power in the region as a whole. I do think that academics and as if we have stopped only at the level of the surface. We talk about groups, terrorist groups, we talk about the objective reasons such as poverty and so on and so forth, all of these things that lead to terrorism. But we stop here as if we do fear getting closer to the real kind of spaces. So terrorism in its relationship with subterranean kind of organizations, the level of manipulation that takes place, we know that these groups are trained. So up to now, we're talking about terrorism between countries. Even in the Arab Maghreb, they do exercise terrorism for them to keep certain matters alive and still trending. And also, we talk about the regional kind of systems or regimes. After 4 months, we have had the first kind of system. We have not seen one academic, one politician who has carried out an exclusion kind of exercise. So when we talk about these groups that are enigmatic, we do refer to what has been mentioned by Hillary Clinton and the formation of Daesh. And also when we talk about political assassinations and Hollande. So very briefly and in summary, I think for us to be able to decipher this enigmatic kind of situation that impedes any political transition, I think we need to move from the terrorist groups into the different terrorist apparatus that try to create and make such terrorism. Thank you so much. I just would like to propose on this occasion, instead of talking about these very important topics, maybe we try to form a working group that would prepare a report about the cost of the non-security, lack of security. So this is going to be very useful instead of just talking and try to move from these topics, from talks and rhetoric into responses, real responses that should take place. I think these things should be reinforced by data that is close to the truth, and then we can give them to the decision makers for them to be using such kind of data and information. There is a point that is very important indeed that has not been mentioned, which is smuggling, which is very important indeed. So smuggling is very important, and there are some other things that are subsidized, merchandised, and the example of Libya. So the liter of petrol is less expensive than 1 liter of water. Yes, so many goods were subsidized in Libya. So I think we do have this problem, the smuggling of goods, of money, and the countries that benefit are silent. And we do see this happen day in, day out. So we have to be very much aware of this matter. And we have to look into it very frankly and very clearly, and we have to be accountable for that. Talking about this is very lengthy, but I'm going to limit what am I saying to this particular matter. Maybe at least we shall have a working group and we should be people who would be dealing with these matters. We need to be very clear. There was one point that was mentioned by Dr. Ahmed, which is corruption. Corruption prevails in the Arab and the Maghreb security apparatuses. So we have to have a solution for such a matter. If security is infiltrated, if the security is a security that receives bribes, then consequently smuggling will take place. And I'm not talking only about merchandise, we're talking also about weapons and drugs as well. So smuggling and terrorism are two sides of the same coin. That is why that these points are very important indeed. Even corruption, I think we should concentrate on it because corrupt people, with all respect to you, they do not like to say it out loud. Thank you very much, Mr. Jamil. In the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful, I have got two observations. The first observation is general. It talks about regional security, whether it has to do with terrorism or to do with migration or drugs or any of the other themes. I think we have to be very keen to try as much as we can to remove it from the crisis between countries, from these circles. And this should not lead us in no way possible, irrespective of the level of tension between opposition and rulers or ruler and opposition. This should not be a point of disparity because terrorism is a threat to everybody and drugs are a threat to everybody, and the same applies to migration. The other point that has been mentioned by Mrs. Muna in her intervention, there is what kind of mutual service between authoritarianism and these kind of matters. And as Lotfi Haji has said, and he talked about the different phenomena of terrorism and assassinations, and also the ambiguity behind those who bless such kind of acts. Sometimes there is a system that tries to create a problem for a neighbor, and that is why they would establish these relationship with these entities that try to threaten this regime. And we have had this in our region. So there are some relationships that are revealed through international outlets or intelligence services about agreements that are written or gentlemen's agreements about this person and that person, this entity and the entity that stands behind the other person in the framework of regional security. And these matters are extremely dangerous because this happens within the framework of regime conflicts and so on and so forth. So this is very important indeed, and attention should be brought to such a matter. Dr. Buyeti talked about this, and he mentioned very important matters in the literature. He talked about this matter and that they serve each other, although this might not be agreed on very openly. Thank you very much, Ahmed Idris. Thank you very much, all of you. One of the Mauritanians was visiting one of the African leaders and he told him, have you seen what is happening to us in Libya? And he said that those who are selling them are the Africans. And we have a number of communities that are common between a number of countries such as Chad and Nigeria and Libya. So the price that we are paying is much larger than we think. Some Africans, they think that we are trying to enslave them, and Algeria is looking very anxiously to the existence of the French that tries to cordon the region, and they fear that we have a rebellion that might explode in the southern part of Libya, and the southern part of Algeria, and the northern part of Mali. So these risks and threats exist, and also the conflicts between the intelligence services of Morocco and Algeria in that region exists, and this is one of the most dangerous kind of matter. It is not just a normal matter. When is the situation is going to explode? If Mali is a failure country, but Mauritania is a loser country, so the geological nature of the country does not allow people to conglomerate, but the nature of marginalization would contribute. So the movement of the Sons of Sahara that has been formed in the southern part of Algeria is testimony to a marginalization that people of Sahara or the desert see. This is not what is being depicted by a number of organizations. This is an exploitation of local needs. And all this shows that the security situation is not an easy one. Sometimes we do tackle the security situation in such sessions superficially, but the matter is much deeper than what it is. It cannot be just transitly be tackled. I do welcome the point that had been mentioned by our colleague, and I do invite Dr. Idris to further develop this idea, which is the security costs of the security costs in the Arab Maghreb. When you talk about migrants, I do think that there is a moral responsibility that should be taken into account when we talk about this matter. We do criticize what Trump is doing and declaring a state of emergency in order to build a wall with Mexico. So the right to transit from one area to another due to circumstances in his own or her own country, I think it is a moral fall. It is not just a matter of interest. We were very much upset as a result of the closing of borders against Syrian refugees, who are 7 million now in different parts of the world. And we are sorry for all the violations that they are subjected to in their attempt to enter neighboring countries or to reach Europe for them to find security. Yes, I do think that Europe wants from the Arab Maghreb to become camps for those people, and we want not to allow people to move. Anthropology and humanity has been based on a number of migrations. We in the Arab Maghreb we are the outcome of a number of migrations that have taken place and that had led to the formation of this social fabric that we have today. I think there is a moral responsibility that should be taken into account when we talk about migrants or refugees. The solution is not to build dividing walls on our borders. Or to try to trade with this matter, as Mohammed al Mukhtar had said. In Libya, we have organized gangs, and the United Nations talked about them. It said those who are working in illegal migration, more than 4,000 people are doing that. We're not talking about Tabu, it's Zuwaya and Tuareg and many, many other groups. And because this is an economic pressure. The same applies when in Lebanon they talk about Syrian refugees. What do we do to refugees? Do we burn them? Do we throw them in the sea? There is a responsibility that is far beyond the concept of the state vis-à-vis humanity. I think it is not acceptable from a moral perspective to deal with these waves of illegal migrants or immigrants as figures only, as numbers. These are human beings. We in Libya resorted to Tunisia, to Egypt, and those in the south resorted to the Sudan. So imagine those borders were closed, and this process of migration is a natural kind of process in human history. This kind of interaction should be taken into account if we look and try to talk about a Arab Maghreb bloc. Our brother talked about investments and how to find and enhance the livelihood of people instead of entering into the disparities and differences as it is happening in Libya. And we have to try to reinforce developments and take the initiative to find Maghrebian solutions and also to deal with these waves of migration as numbers of figures. I think here we have a moral responsibility. I think there is a philosophical problematic that should be taken into account. Thank you so much. بطلت أجمع سامر. Thank you. بطلت أجمع. I would like to continue where Mr. Ismail ended. I have reservations with regard to the theme of this particular session. I think that putting these three phenomena within the same context, in the same basket, makes us move on two paths. The moral side, so we have terrorism, refugees, smuggling of drugs, weapons, and so on and so forth. These are three different fields, but from an operational perspective, we cannot find solutions for terrorism as we do when it comes to smugglers of weapons and drugs and so on and so forth, and the matter of refugees in the same way. I think within this context, we are trying to approach our security. This is over securitization. So this leads us to finding solutions that would deepen and make the situation much more intricate than finding a solution to it. Thank you. This theme, the theme of this session, is the outcome of importing the European model, and this is very important indeed, through discourse and not from reality. So reaching real pieces of evidence that would have statistical kind of presence. When you have isolated kind of cases, you cannot generalize them. So the relationship between these components, this relationship is very difficult. Linking them is very difficult. That is why we have a kind of a discourse or discursive practices. This has allowed the different security apparatuses in general and not the government. The governments have adopted the discourse of what D.D. Bigubi said, those who try to adopt the discourse of security. The second point, it has to do with the regional security. So the Arab Maghreb has entered into that, and the governments have some difficulties. It is difficult for them to adopt these ideas in order to adapt these securities. So, facing regional threats on the basis of a national kind of policy, these countries, such as Algeria and Morocco, have to revisit their policies of armament to give your armed forces fighting jets to target the strongholds of terrorists, but to have submarines. This is not going to be in order to target terrorists, and this is very costly when it comes to the states. So there is a relationship with regard to corruption and the threats of non-state actors. Because the strategic endeavors were difficult and different. Now, these regular armies are still part of this Cold War mentality in the Maghreb region, and now they confront
The second point is to do with terrorism and non-security. Is the first does the first lead to the second or vice versa? When we look at the hotspots in the Arab world, we notice that terrorism has dug its heel in the hotspots because terrorism feeds on the hotspots. In the past, Libya hadn't witnessed any terrorism, but why we hadn't witnessed the militias in the 90s? Because Libya was safe. It didn't have any hotspots. And the last issue is to do with marginalization, because the uh, regimes usually follow a zero-sum game, and there is no room to uh, uh, have a win-win situation or formula. So the liberals and the realists, the liberals used to uh, as a matter of fact, refused vested interests, and then they agreed on uh, the fact that struggle might lead to a certain space for cooperation. However, in the Maghreb world, the interrelationship uh, are subject to the Hobbesian model. However, the Maghreb relationship with the others, especially Europe, uh, do belong to Kant, the philosopher, or Kantian relationship, and they haven't positioned themselves in between. Uh, John Locke, uh, when he talked about the three chaoses, but to be optimistic, this kind of reciprocal exclusion uh, leads to the fact that the borders between Morocco and Algeria are the most stable, but diplomatically is the most tense from the eyes of Morocco. Why they are stable? Because the state has security forces that are powerful. Thank you. Saifullah Mashat from the Tunisian civil society. I would like to link this intervention with the uh, previous intervention, especially when we are talking about the horizons. When we talk about the horizons, we talk about the future, and thus we need a vision, especially when we have two centers of studies here co-hosting this conference. I think that if we look at the Maghreb as a mass or a block or sole countries, we don't know where to start. If we want to have a change, we need to know whether we start with security first, politics first, sustainability first, or the market first. And I think here is the bottom line. In Tunisia and in the Maghreb world, the security dossier is very powerful because we need the security in order for the process of change to succeed. In the past, Tunisia had politics first and then the democratic path, and then you'll have security and economy and so on and so forth. Others think that the problem is to do with the economy, and that's why we need to start with the market. So we think that if we study the horizon and if we could envisage the future, if we put into place one scenario, two, three, and four, and see the implications thereby in every single country and in the bloc as a whole. There is another challenge. This region belongs geographically to which priority? Africa first or Europe or the Mediterranean? It's very important. If we find a solution, then we find certain responses. In addition to that, there is another problem that is when we want to deal with our reality, the problem would distract us from the project itself. And this what made the Maghreb project ambiguous. Was it an aim by itself, or was it a tool? Was it a means to an end or an end? Thank you. Aziz Al Hamrouni from the civil society, the Tunisian civil society. When it comes to the economic and political challenges vis-à-vis the reactivation of the Maghreb Union, uh, you've talked about different politics, different economic policies, and there is disparity between the policies of every country. However, the security challenges are the same: terrorism, human trafficking, smuggling, refugees, uh, drug dealing, and immigration, and so on and so forth. Uh, we all in the same boat in this regard, so we need to have perhaps a Magharibi Security Council so that it could coordinate between the countries in order to have security solutions for all the countries. It will be more effective rather than singing from different hymn sheets. Thank you. From a perspective, I think that there is a problem in the concept of the threats. After the 11th of September, the USA was able to put into place a concept that was adopted by all: illegal immigration, terrorism, and so on and so forth. But do we think that these threats are the genuine threats that we are facing in the Arab world and the Maghreb world? I think that these kind of threats are resembling a bogeyman for the sake of certain interests. In Morocco, for example, there are plenty of events that were described as terrorist acts, but they were ambiguous. In 2003, up to this moment, nobody knows the perpetrators. The authority didn't provide us with a response, and no one claimed such event. After the 20th of February's movement and after the protests, a person would come along and tries to explode a center in Marrakesh. So our regimes in the Maghreb and in the Arab world uh, conformed themselves to the priorities and the threats of the USA. As I said, however, we need to question such concept and to differentiate between the threats that resemble bogeymen on the part of the regimes and the other ones. The war on terrorism was used for the sake of the Western Sahara's dossier. So we need to differentiate between the two. I think corruption and tyranny are the two threats that are faced with the people. And some of the symptoms are to do with terrorism and transnational crimes and so on and so forth. In light of transnational threats that targeted the Sahel and the Maghreb during the last decades, there was a question posed: would it be possible for the security to succeed when the politics and economy failed in unifying the Maghreb? And today we pose this question. You have talked about marginalization of one another, but why would it be possible to marginalize each other, and who benefits from such marginalization? If we have a collective strategy to face such threats, transnational threats, Tegan Turin exposed the convoluted nuances of terrorism. After Tegan Turin, Maghreb is a must. Fathallah said that after Barcelona, Maghreb is a must. Perhaps security-wise, we ought to have perhaps uh, we have to have collective voice to put into place a collective strategy. Mona was looking at her phone, and I thought she was consulting the Facebook, but she was reading from her phone. So she outwitted me. Uh, I would like to talk about the issue of immigration. We had put into place a study in Libya, and we published it in English. Uh, the taboo are not only responsible for human trafficking. The problem of Libya is that after the vacuum, it became a transit country to Europe. 174,000, 174,000 immigrant, illegal immigrant, reached Europe through Libya. Some of them came from Eritrea, Sudan, even from Syria and Southeast Asia and South Africa. So the mafias liaise with themselves. There are European mafias that deal with such issue, but sometimes people blame a taboo. The Libyans are there, the Swedes, the Egyptians, the Malays, and plenty of people deal with human trafficking. I would like to talk about the concept of threats. When I talk about threats, I think of the people, those who are threatened. Here, I'm talking about Max Weber's uh, definition of the government. The government hegemonizes the use of force. If it's not there, then we need to look for non-state actors and others. I just wanted to talk about this matter from the descriptive kind of point of view rather than the moral point of view. As far as the refugees are concerned and the moral side, yes, there is the moral side, as Ismail said, i.e., the refugee is a victim, he or she seeks security, but we put them as if they are threats as well. But how could we deal with this complex phenomenon? The studies say that the international law has a definition, so we don't have to go through the nitty gritty of these issues. These groups if they are considered terrorists, then I will depend on this definition accorded with the United Nations. The phenomenon of refugees is a complex one. It has moral and security kind of dimensions. Because human trafficking would augment terrorism, even if they don't want to threaten uh, the country. Their resources will be used by terrorists sometimes, and there is also a political kind of dimension. Are we talking here about the far right? I think this is a phenomenon. This day was long indeed and was very enriching. I would like to thank you all for your contributions, and I would like to thank you, and we'll see you soon. The session is adjourned. Thank you.